Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us just after 7:30 for this fantastic conversation this evening about Scope 3 emissions in the ACT. What can we do about the emissions that happen outside Canberra, but we are responsible for here in Canberra, with our ACT Commissioner for Sustainability and the Environment and the author of this new report that was tabled just the other day, last week, Dr Sophie Lewis. My name's Tim Hollo. I'm the Greens candidate for Canberra and Executive Director of the Green Institute, and it's my pleasure and privilege to be emceeing this evening's conversation. Before I go any further, on behalf of all of us, I acknowledge that this conversation is happening on stolen land, on land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And we pay our respects to elders past, present, and those still to come from the Ngunnawal, Ngambri, Wiradjuri, and Garigo people all across this region who have stewarded this land with love and care for millennia, countless generations, longer than we can imagine, really. And we have so much to learn from the First Nations people of this land who have lived here, sustaining the land and living, understanding themselves to be fundamentally interdependent with the land, and so different from the way that we Westerners treat the land as a resource to extract value from. And really that's got so much to do with what we're talking about tonight, understanding that here in Canberra, we've done some wonderful things, thanks to, in particular, the really fabulous work of the Greens in government here in Canberra for a dozen years and more. But we still take more than we give back, a tremendous amount more than we give back. And we do not live sustainably here in this land. And that's what this report really is digging into in very important ways. So this evening, I'm going to introduce our leader of the ACT Greens and Minister for Emissions Reductions, Shane Rattenbury, who needs no introduction, I think, to any of us, who was the minister who commissioned this report. He's going to introduce Dr Sophie Lewis, our Commissioner for Sustainability and the Environment, who oversaw the writing of this fabulous report on Scope 3 emissions. And then our Minister for the Environment, Rebecca Vassarotti, is going to make some reflections, having tabled the report in the Legislative Assembly last week. And then we're going to have a bit of a discussion on the panel and Q&A session with any of you who've got anything to ask of Sophie or the two ministers who we have here tonight. So really, that's it from me. At this point, I'll come back and MC the conversation later. But at this point, I'll hand over to Minister Shane Rattenbury. Thank you so much, Shane.
Thanks very much, Tim, and welcome everybody. It's great to see you all online for this. I think it'll be a really interesting discussion this evening. As Tim flagged, I commissioned this report during the last term of the Assembly, and it was actually in action in our 2019 climate change strategy. That strategy is a 5-year plan through to 2025. And the ACT, of course, has made great progress on particularly our Scope 2 emissions, moving to 100% renewable electricity. And we're now really starting to focus on our Scope 1 emissions, particularly our transport emissions and our emissions that come from fossil fuel gas. And there's no question that we are one of the leading jurisdictions globally when it comes to that. We've cut our emissions by more than 40% on 1990 levels, and that is great progress, but certainly not a basis to rest on our laurels. And one of the reasons we put Scope 3 emissions in the 2019 climate change strategy was we wanted to start thinking about, well, what comes next? There's still so much work to do on Scope 1 particularly, but we also know that as a high-consuming city, as a relatively wealthy city, the ACT has an enormous ecological footprint and therefore a significant Scope 3 footprint. And my view was that we needed to start thinking about how we could impact that. And whilst under international accounting rules, we are not formally responsible for Scope 3 emissions, there is no doubt that as a city, we can influence supply chains, we can influence product development, and we can use our buying power to amplify our impact beyond the ACT's borders. I think the report that Sophie and her team have prepared really makes that point. I'm not going to steal any of her thunder by referencing the report, but I think it's made a really valuable contribution and reflected to all of us some important things we can think about in terms of trying to have an impact beyond the borders of our territory. So I don't want to speak for too long. I want to thank Sophie very much for taking the time to come and speak to this group tonight. We really appreciate the work on the report. I think it is leading edge work. No one else has really done much work like this on trying to quantify their Scope 3 emissions. And so, again, the ACT continues to lead the way as we try and do our part, both locally and as good global citizens, to make sure that we limit climate change, that we take action in this critical decade, and that we do our very best to ensure that we hand future generations the planet that they deserve to live on. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr Sophie Lewis, the ACT's Commissioner for the Environment, and invite her to talk to us about the report. Thanks very much, Sophie.
Thank you. So I think that was a really apt introduction, both from Tim and from Shane, because Tim really highlighted that nothing that I'm going to talk about this evening is novel, in the sense that I'm going to be talking about valuing resources, which is something that the Ngunnawal and other Indigenous people have been doing for millennia. But in another sense, it's incredibly novel because no other jurisdiction has looked into this. So I think those two sit together quite nicely, and I appreciate that. So I'm going to, hopefully, because my computer hates Zoom, share my screen so I can share some of the infographics that were this one here, that were developed by the office for the report. So I'm hoping you can see that now.
We can. Thanks, Sophie.
Excellent. So when my office was directed to undertake this investigation, the first thing we did was we realised we actually have a big problem with Scope 3, and that's not just our Scope 3 emissions, but that very term. So I would say that besides Joe sitting in this virtual room, nobody knows or cares about what Scope 3 are, and that term, the very use of that term, really does bring about disinterest from people. So really, why should we know or care about what Scope 3 are? So what we thought was the best way to differentiate the different greenhouse gas emissions types, the scopes, and therefore why we should know and care about them, is to talk about an activity or a product. So let's start with each of us and imagining something that's really common. And that's what we've done with this t-shirt infographic here. So you imagine that we're up the top at our computers, or maybe we're out at the shops because we don't like online shopping, and we throw an extra t-shirt either into our online shopping cart or into our shopping trolley. So we know that's just a few dollars more. You can't really remember what you got at home. You hate shopping. You don't know how many t-shirts you have and what's worse for wear. So you might as well just grab a few extra things. So if we pick that apart and look at what's behind that t-shirt purchase, we can start to look at that in terms of the greenhouse gas footprint, or the carbon footprint of that product. So the carbon footprint is a term that we use that really encompasses a whole suite of gases, not just carbon dioxide. So in terms of greenhouse gases, there's a carbon footprint to transport your t-shirt from Fishwick or Mitchell or some sort of warehouse and deliver it to your door. Or maybe you're in the shops and there's the emissions from your car that you drove from your house to the shops and then came back again with your t-shirt. So those emissions are Scope 1 emissions. They're the emissions that were generated within the ACT. They're your Scope 1 emissions. There's also your Scope 2 emissions. So they're the lights that you flick on when you get home, and you've found that Australia Post have delivered and you excitedly rip your satchel open, or maybe you're at the shops and you're in Big W or Kmart and there are lights on while you're doing your shopping there. So they're Scope 2 emissions. They're grid supplied electricity. So in that simple act of buying a t-shirt, we can see there's Scope 1 emissions, which are emissions related directly to activities within the ACT, and there's Scope 2 emissions, which are our grid supplied emissions. But before our t-shirt gets to Canberra, that humble t-shirt, it has really been through a lot. And that's what this infographic that was developed for our report tries to show, that the simple act of buying that t-shirt and what occurs within the ACT does not represent the full greenhouse gas footprint of that product. So even if we really simplify the production chain for our t-shirt, and most of those steps occur in a single country, every single step occurs in different locations. So we require transportation, we require warehouse storage between destinations, and in each of our farming, processing, sewing, each of those steps, there's machinery involved, there's energy required, and in most jurisdictions, most of our product manufacturing jurisdictions, they all produce, they're likely produced from fossil fuels. So that's kind of a long-winded way to start talking about what these scopes are, but we've found that talking about an activity or a product is a really good way to demonstrate that scope 1 and scope 2 emissions for our greenhouse gases are really just one part of what goes into a product. And these are the definitions here. So when I went through that example there, we talked about scope 1 emissions being driving your car to Big W, the emissions released inside Canberra as a result of activities occurring in it. Scope 2 are our grid supplied electricity or energy purchased to be used inside the city. And then scope 3 are emissions released outside of Canberra, but a result of activities occurring inside. So we talked in that introduction a little bit about what's occurring with Canberra and our emissions reduction targets. So our emission reduction target of net zero emissions by 2045. So currently this considers only direct emissions in the ACT and emissions from purchased electricity. So those are our scope 1 and our scope 2 emissions. So the emissions that went into that t-shirt, so emissions produced by goods or services from outside the ACT are not currently included. And that approach is universal. I really have to emphasize that. That isn't anything specific to the ACT. That is the way that carbon and greenhouse gas accounts are kept. So that's the way things are done. So when we talk about net zero emissions, when jurisdictions talk about their net zero emissions, that's incorporating scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And I've got a note here that is the approach used under the UNFCCC for reporting on greenhouse gas inventories. So our investigation was directed to look at the totality of greenhouse gas emissions for Canberra and to determine where they're coming from and make suggestions about what we can do about it. Jumping straight into the results. So I didn't want to go into too much detail about the methodology. I know that will be of interest to some people, but not to everyone. I'm happy to answer some questions on that. I'll likely get stumped pretty quickly in terms of talking about the specifics of the methodology. All of that information is on the website, which I saw was already shared in the chat. Our website has a plain language summary. We have our report, and then we have the documentation of the technical analyses that were provided to our office that were foundational to our report. So really we kind of have a hierarchy of information, and anyone who has a high level of interest and expertise can really dig into the methods that we used in the accounts. But there's a few important points that I really want to make to help us understand the results that are going to be presented here. And the key thing about assessing these scope 3 emissions is that they can't be directly measured. We can't go out with an instrument and measure scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions globally that relate to what's occurring in the ACT. They have to be modelled. They are modelled through these complex environmental input-output models, and what they do is aggregate financial data, so financial information for what's being spent in the ACT, and then they connect that to greenhouse gas data. So it's a combination of financial and environmental data. And the reason that I'm emphasising that is that there's assumptions that go into determining these scope 3 accounts, and there's different methods that can be applied. So not to say that the results that we're presenting aren't accurate, but we have to understand that they're model-based information, and you could use a different methodology and come up with slightly different values. The point is that by using a methodology that's been assessed in peer-reviewed literature, you can compare jurisdictions, you can compare trends over time. So I know I haven't given you a whole lot of information about what data went into and the specific model that was used. I just want to emphasize that these aren't directly measured, they're modeled information. So if we go on to those results that I gave you the sneak peek of, we can see that when we look at the contribution of Scope 3 to the ACT's carbon emissions, that nearly 94% of our total carbon footprint in the ACT relates to Scope 3 emissions. So that means that 94% of our emissions are occurring because of goods and services that are bought in here. You can see we don't have any Scope 2 emissions since 2020, when our grid supplied energy, our Scope 2 emissions weren't contributing to this because they were green sourced. But this is really getting to that point that Shane made in the introduction, that although we have these ambitious greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, we also have a very high ecological footprint, and that mismatch between the total ecological footprint of the ACT and our greenhouse gas emissions cuts is really coming through on that 94% of our emissions now being Scope 3. So the analysis that was done for our report looked at the ultimate source of ACT's emissions. We found that, what have I got here, 30% of the ACT's Scope 3 emissions originate from outside of Australia, and more than 50% come from Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. So this is sort of essentially a heat map showing where the highest concentration of emissions flowing into Canberra come from. And the reason that this is important is because it demonstrates that supply chain, the flow of carbon into Canberra, but it also shows us where we might be getting products and services coming in where they have particular work to do in terms of reducing of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions in those jurisdictions. So this can provide us with targeted information. And we next looked at what was the product groups that had the highest Scope 3 emissions for the ACT. So the methodology that I really ran over very quickly earlier breaks down the Scope 3 emissions into many different groups. So we've just looked at quite a course level here, but in the report that's on our website that was provided by UNSW, you can see much more granular information. But at this high level, we see that the highest Scope 3 emissions are coming from transport, postal and warehousing. Food is another big contributor, and also retail, trade and construction. We next looked at the breakdown of Scope 3 emissions in terms of essentially end user. So 60% of the Scope 3 emissions being driven by household contributions, 33% by government operations, and 8% by business. So within the report, we really tried to provide information for individuals that would make them feel empowered about their decisions and the way those decisions influence the carbon footprint of their households, but we didn't want to blame individual Canberrans because the majority of the Scope 3 emissions can be attributed to household contributions. And that can be quite difficult to communicate in a way that makes people feel that their choices are valuable, but not that they are solely responsible. So within the report, we didn't make recommendations to individuals, but we did try to provide information about what particularly engaged or concerned Canberrans can do regarding this high contribution from households. And again, that really goes back to those kind of core sustainability principles of buying less, buying secondhand, borrowing, repairing, keeping products in use for as long as possible, reducing waste, and things like being mindful of the contributions of travel, and particularly air travel. So hopefully we managed to communicate that information in a fairly sensitive way. The next thing we did was look at two sort of focus areas. The first one was around food. And again, we tried to take that sensitivity into this analysis of food. So again, we don't make any recommendations about what kind of food people are trying to eat. And we tried to make it clear that this analysis is looking purely from a carbon footprint perspective, not any of the other environmental factors around food and things like water use and biodiversity, or any of the kind of cultural, religious, or personal preference around food. So this is a diagram which really simplistically summarizes the carbon footprint of different food types. And I'll note this is by kilogram, so it's not by portion size. We're not suggesting that this is a direct comparison of a cup of coffee compared to beef, but essentially this shows us, if we're talking about greenhouse gases, about the value of food and how resource intensive in terms of carbon different food types are. So food was 12% of the scope 3 emissions for the ACT. Most of that food is, well, the vast majority is produced outside, our food is produced outside the ACT, and the carbon footprint of that food is derived from a whole set of processes and changes. So everything from land use change and clearing in terms of agriculture, agricultural processes such as tilling, use of farm machinery, use of herbicides, pesticides, the energy that goes into producing animal feed, emissions from ruminants, which is one of the reasons why beef is so high, and then also in terms of the food supply, so the transport and warehousing of food. So although we didn't make any recommendations in the report regarding what people should be eating, we did look into things like food waste reduction, and also in terms of the emissions from the avoiding food ending up in landfill, and we looked at the food and organics and the FOGO scheme. So there's lots of information in the report on food. The next focus area we had was around construction. And this is what we called the Scope 3 building checklist, which was trying to bring together all the information around buildings and infrastructure. So again, construction came out as a big contributor to Scope 3 emissions. That's not really a surprise. The construction industry is a huge consumer of resources, and particularly carbon intensive resources. There's really varying estimates of the contribution of construction products to greenhouse gas emissions. There's in terms of some of the product groups, there's information that steel and cement alone contribute up to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. There's some estimates that it's far higher than that, some that it's far lower. But a lot of that is relating to how energy intensive the production of those materials is in the first place, and then the distances which they're transported. But although that's a global figure, we know that in Australia, the emissions relating to the construction sector are really significant. And I've got some figures here from our report that in 2013, the construction sector contributed 18% of the total national carbon footprint. So we made a whole set of recommendations, formal recommendations to government in the report regarding buildings and infrastructure. But again, a lot of these came back to some of these really simple principles about does a knockdown rebuild need to occur, or can we refit an existing building? So that's whether the building has to be new, do the materials have to be new? and can we use less of the high embodied carbon materials like cement and steel? So I talked right at the start about how, in one sense, this report is not particularly novel because we're talking about essentially using less or valuing goods and services more highly. But in another sense, it is very exciting and it's highly innovative that this report has been directed to us and been undertaken. And I really don't think that that should, well, that's my dog joining in. I really don't think that that should be undervalued. I think that's hugely significant. And while doing this report, after this report was published, I heard a lot of comments about that we don't really need to worry about this because our scope 3 is really just someone else's scope 1 and it's their problem, not ours. So we could discuss that at length, but without sort of delving into the ethics of that and those responsibilities, I've put this little figure up that shows projections or a possible pathway forward in terms of reductions in scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. And we can see, well, we can see here in our scope 1 emissions. So our scope 2 have disappeared. We've, in the ACT, gotten rid of our scope 2 and we can see this steady decline in scope 1 emissions all the way through to 2045. And we could feel satisfied by that and think that that is contribution enough. But if we also add in our scope 3 emissions, we can see just how quickly we can accelerate that decrease in what we could otherwise think are someone else's problem and someone else's responsibility. So by addressing our scope 3 emissions, we can essentially accelerate that decarbonisation across jurisdictions by showing that leadership. And look how happy the ACT is sliding down that pathway to decarbonisation. So these are some of the recommendations, or these are the recommendations that were made, but these are a plain language summary. So on our webpage, we have our full report and we've got some plain language summaries. So this clearly isn't the language that was provided as recommendation to government. But I'll just run through some of these so you can get a sense of those. So we recommended that we focus on new ways to measure scope 3 emissions and that this information is published every 3 years by government. We recommended that the ACT talk to other states and territories to ensure progress is taking place. We had big problems with finding the information we needed. I'm not suggesting that that is intentional, but there is inconsistencies and in data that's published by government, and there is varying levels of data, financial data that's published between directorates, and that was a huge barrier. So we recommended that we make sure that all the data that's required to measure scope 3 emissions is published. We recommended that the ACT government set a goal for reducing scope 3 emissions that come from us undertaking our own operations. So not a scope 3 emission reduction target for the ACT. We've suggested that scope 1 and 2 should be kept separate as they are for all jurisdictions. But that when we're looking at reducing scope 3 emissions, we start with the ACT government's own operations to make sure that when the government buys goods or services, so in terms of procurement, low scope 3 emissions become a key factor in decision making. This one I'm sure will be hugely popular, but making sure that office spaces aren't bigger than the size that's needed for the people who occupy them. And we had some specific recommendations around sizing there. That we continue with flexible work arrangements where that's a positive thing, so that people aren't travelling unnecessary. We included a recommendation around information around food waste and composting, building materials. Number 9 was a goal for reducing how much of our city's food goes into landfill, and that's really emphasising that FOGO program. Number 10 was to do further research into how we can increase the amount of low carbon cement available in the ACT. The next one was a goal for reducing emissions from public infrastructure. And the final one was quite a sizable one with several subsections, but that was really around reviewing planning, construction and building to make sure that Scope 3 emissions are important there too. So I'll stop sharing my screen and come back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sophie. That was a really wonderful presentation, taking us through some really substantial detail in a very understandable way. So thank you so much for that. We really appreciate it. I might now invite Rebecca Vassarotti, our Minister for the Environment, who tabled this report last week, to give us some of her reflections on the report before we go to Q&A. And remind you that if you have any questions, whether you're watching here on Zoom or on Facebook, please pop them in the chat and we can put them to Sophie or any of our other presenters. But in the meantime, over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks very much, Tim, and thank you so much, Sophie. And I think it's really interesting when you reflect on Scope 3 emissions and the knowledge and wisdom that we can learn from First Nations people in terms of, Scope 3 emissions wouldn't really be an issue if we sort of, cared for the land and looked at how we limited our footprint at all. So that's really important, really important reflection. So look, I was absolutely delighted to get this report and really wanted to thank Sophie and the team for the work that she's done, because I think it is a really important contribution at a really important time, with the reflection on the work that we're doing on carbon emission reduction. This is a journey that we're all going on in terms of even understanding what we're talking about. And we rightly have been focusing on Scope 2 and Scope 1 emissions, but getting to this issue of Scope 3 emissions is really, really important and something that we haven't really done a lot of work with. And I think that Sophie referenced the fabulous Joe Clay, MLA from Ginninderra, who's sitting on this call, who really, is one of the, what has been one of the real thought leaders, particularly in relation to that issue of how individuals and households can really start to think about this issue of Scope 3 emissions through her fabulous work around her carbon diet and sort of looking at the different ways that we could really impact on reducing our footprint. But this is something that for many of us, we haven't been able to grapple with in the same way. So I'd really encourage people to have a look at the work of Jo in relation to that, because I think it is really interesting, and I know that she's doing more work in relation to that as well. In relation to this report coming to us as a government right now, I think it is a really important time, and certainly what I've been focusing on and reflecting on is what we can do as government. And because we do have a whole range of roles that we play as government, we are a purchaser, and so we can actually make decisions as a purchaser. We're a constructor, governments, as a government we build things. We're a regulator. We're an employer, we're a policy maker, we're connected with our community. So there's a whole range of roles that we can really play and really drive the work in terms of how we do reduce our footprint and really get to grips with the issue of Scope 3 emissions. And it almost feels like we did some conspiring in the back end, but as the Minister for Environment that has responsibility for agriculture, and as well as the minister that has responsibility in sustainable construction and building, I was kind of delighted to read the report and see that these were two areas that Sophie and the team focused on, because they are actually two big policy areas that we're looking at and really wanting to do some more work in. So it is something that is going to be really helpful on a practical level as we look at what we do in those two areas. So, if we look at the area of food, as Sophie referenced, there is some good work that's happening. Particularly, we are delighted that we are moving to the point where we will have FOGO, food organic waste, being collected at a household level by the curbside. So I think that is a really important thing. So there's some work that's been happening, but we are sort of just about to embark on looking at developing up a food and fibre strategy. And I think as part of this, climate adaptation and thinking about things like Scope 3 has to be a really key element of this. I think in the agricultural space, one of the things that we can really do is look at how we build our climate resilience and actually produce more of our food in the ACT and its surrounds. So while some of that is actually about moving our emissions from Scope 3 to Scope 2, but also really, just looking at how we can become more resilient. So we're really looking forward to starting that conversation with the community, and there'll be some consultation that will be happening over the next few months. So really looking forward to hearing people's contributions to that. And then if we look in terms of construction, again, there's good work happening. When we sort of look at even some of our major projects that we've been doing around light rail, Scope 3 emissions has been something that was looked at, and the issue of embodied carbon is something that we are actually talking about as a government. But I'm really keen for us to be looking at what we can do through mechanisms such as the construction code. There is a real appetite, and there are some real industry leaders. Shane and myself were in a meeting just today where we were sort of talking about some of the industry leaders that are really keen to get into this conversation about embodied energy and what we can do to really showcase the ACT as a leader in this area. We've got significant ambition that we have captured within the parliamentary and governing agreement, and I think this report really provides us with a great opportunity to really reflect and see, as we move forward with some of this, how we can ensure that Scope 3 emissions is really driving some of our thinking. So what will happen? So we've tabled the report in the Assembly. We will work with our government colleagues in terms of a government response. While there is great things happening, some of this can be a little bit confronting. Some people can go, well, what's the point of us doing Scope 1 and Scope 2 if most of it sits outside our boundaries? And I think we really need to work with everyone to explain why what the different emissions are. But as Sophie talks about, it actually is very empowering, and it gives us a real opportunity to make purchasing decisions to really drive supply change. So I think there's lots of opportunity in this for us to really feel that we are making a contribution, whether it be at an individual level, a household level, a government level, a community level, about how we continue to position ourselves as real leaders in this area. And so just wanted to really thank Sophie and the team for the work. And I think I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rebecca. There's a couple of questions starting to come through, and I'll encourage others to ask them, and I'll put them to our panel shortly. But I might take the chair's prerogative and ask a question of my own. I was really, really pleased to hear you, Sophie, emphasise the point that this report shouldn't be taken as seeking to blame individuals and blame consumers for their choices. And you too, Rebecca, making that point. I think it's probably the most fraught question really around the whole issue of Scope 3 in some ways, isn't it? And I wonder if any of the three of you would be interested in reflecting on kind of how you do manage that balance, in a sense of firstly from a point of view of analysis of what's going on and reporting on it, and then from a government's point of view about how you manage that tricky balance where you're not blaming consumers, but you are helping people kind of find ways of living and consuming more sustainably, and trying to find the policy levers that you can press without turning into, you know, this culture war often argument that we might end up having about whether or not people should be eating red meat and all of those kinds of questions. Sophie, can I ask you first for your reflections on kind of...
Yeah, well, I think that question is more straightforward for me because I don't have to worry about government or politics, and I can, you know, just essentially talk directly to community, in which case it is really far simpler because people within the community want to know what they can do. So for them, they're already coming from a position of wanting to feel empowered, and seeing that their financial decisions are important. So in that sense, the way people choose to spend their money, you know, on what products, on what form those products take, is a way that they can have influence on the carbon footprint associated with their lifestyles. So I think it's a lot easier for me that you shouldn't feel bad for having your coffee and chocolate, Tim, but the way that you value those products or the way that fits into the whole set of choices you're making within your life is now better informed because you know that there's a carbon footprint associated with coffee and chocolate, which is not actually that intuitive to know that. You don't think, oh, I'm having my coffee, that's a carbon intensive activity. You know that that's associated with driving a car, or running your air conditioning in summer if you don't have your solar panels. So from our sense, that is really a lot simpler because providing people with information really empowers them to think about what they're doing and why and how valuable it is to them. For you, your coffee and chocolate's important and valuable, so that's great, but now you know more about that.
Excellent, thank you. Rebecca,
I'm happy, I'm happy to jump in. I actually think that information piece and being an informed consumer, we can't discount the importance of that, because also even if we make a particular decision on one day, you know, like our increased information and reflection on this issue might mean that we make different choices, you know, down the track. So I think that is really important. For me, I think, you know, two roles that government can play is they can actually drive an environment where there are different choices. You know, like part of the challenge for jurisdiction like the ACT is it's actually really hard to buy a t-shirt that isn't produced in China. So, you know, like we can actually look at how we can do things like foster local enterprise. And I think this is one of the opportunities in the urban agriculture space in terms of how we can actually create an environment where there are different choices that consumers can make, because often people are making the choices because there aren't really any others. And we need to ensure that those local choices aren't, you know, bourgeois choices that actually, you know, for people who are, you know, struggling to get by day to day, they can't make those decisions either because they're actually, you know, people are being priced out of the market. So I think there's a really important role to play there. And I think the other role that governments can really play is provide leadership. And so, you know, again, in terms of how we engage in this issue and how we demonstrate, you know, the way choices can be made and how we drive, you know, how we do drive change through regulation and legislation. I think they're the, you know, some of the key things that we can do to respond to that. So it's not left to the individual to make those choices, that it becomes the standard.
And for me, Tim, I think one of the interesting parts of this report is how it's interpreted. You know, there's a real risk there that people who are frankly climate skeptics or just want to be cynical could look at this and say, look, 94% of emissions, what the ACT is doing is not worth it. You know, it's all a bit of a joke. The ACT government's sort of saying it's doing all these things. The community's been trying to make an effort, and look, it's only this small part of it. I think, you know, that interpretation and that risk is there, but I don't think that's where we should. That's not how we should interpret this report. I think that, you know, we have a very direct responsibility to reduce our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and we must do that. We have both a moral and a scientific responsibility to do it. But the optimistic side of this, and I think Sophie made this point quite well, is that this report empowers us to think about how we can use our buying power. As a relatively wealthy community, we do consume a lot. And so picking up on Rebecca's point, we can now make choices about where does our T-shirt come from, or can I get coffee that comes from a carbon neutral coffee production? I actually saw a story on ABC News last week about some farmers from Tasmania who are producing carbon positive beef. They've developed a system whereby the way they organise it all, the cows eat the grass and the grass absorbs enough carbon that it actually overall it's more of a sink than an emission source. And so this report empowers us to think about those sort of choices. Can we go out there and make better observations? As the ACT government, can we go and buy concrete for our projects that's more carbon friendly? Because we know that they're starting to produce concrete that's got carbon embedded into it. So I think that's what it does. And that's certainly how I think we should interpret this report and how we should use it to make a difference.
Yeah, and I'll just follow on from that briefly and say, in this forum, I haven't emphasised the value of the work that's being done on Scope 1. So I've just really emphasised the 94% because it's assumed that we all in this group find value in having emissions reductions target. But in the report, we do talk about how really it's on the basis of that good work and ambition that we can now start to look and expect the same from other jurisdictions who are supplying goods and services into the ACT. So I'll definitely second those comments by Shane.
That's actually a perfect transition, perfect segue into the next set of questions I want to ask. There's a few questions that kind of all are taking the Scope 3 idea and saying, okay, so what can we do about other jurisdictions? And I might kind of group them together. There's one which the rest of you haven't seen, which has come through on Facebook from Sharon, asking, what can the ACT government do if external parties do not come to the table about reducing their Scope 1 emissions, which form a significant part of our Scope 3? That's one part of the question. I want to group it with a couple of others. There's one from David Sadler in there asking if there's any sign of similar analysis of Scope 3 from other state governments, which I think in terms of Sharon's question would potentially increase the potential for the growth of pressure on the high emitting states to start looking at their Scope 1. And there was another question that I thought went with it neatly from Dean Muir. As people have pointed out, Scope 3 emissions cover a lot of processes out of the control of both individuals and also beyond the power of the ACT to change, for instance, in the supply chain of global corporations. To that end, what ideas might we take from this report and extend countrywide? I think particularly from our two ministers who sit on various COAG committees and things, I'd be really interested in your observations, but also Sophie's on those questions.
Yeah, look, I think it's a really good they're really good questions because I think we've recognised that there isn't a whole lot of work that's going on in this area, that we are a bit of a leading jurisdiction. And I know with Shane having commissioned the report, he might have some more knowledge in relation to that. I think it is really, for me, I think it is really useful to look at it sort of almost from a sector by sector perspective. And I think that the building area is a really good example of that we can certainly drive some change through our national forums like building ministers, that we are actually right now going through a conversation around increased energy efficiency standards. It's a pretty interesting conversation we're having at the moment. And there is starting to be a conversation about the need to move away just from looking at this issue in terms of operationalised, but in terms of embodied emissions as well. And as I said, I think that there are some industry leaders. I think that there are elements of business that are really getting this, and so that will start to, we're seeing with some of the ways that we're looking at energy standards in buildings around green star approaches, that they're moving into embodied emissions as well, and there will be some innovation that is driven. But I think it is really up to us to be demonstrating how this can work and how this can be a really useful process for other jurisdictions. But I'll hand over to Shane.
Yeah. In terms of the big picture on it, I think as much as we all despair about the role of the federal government and the contribution of people like Matt Canavan, we need not lose sight of the fact that in Australia, every state and territory has a net zero target that they have committed to it, and many of them have plans to roll them out. Just as we saw in the US, where during the Trump presidency, the federal position was dreadful, but a lot of states were doing amazing things. And then once you had a new president, President Biden, come in, you're able to actually accelerate some of that work very quickly. So I see optimism in that. I look at some of the outcomes from COP26. And if we think about the fact that a whole lot of our emissions come from overseas, commitments that overseas countries making will help us. Their work will reduce our Scope 3 emissions because they also have to reduce their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, which will flow through for us. I mean, even at COP26 last week, we saw an agreement signed on developing green shipping across the planet. And if we go back to Sophie's diagram on the T-shirt production, that will start to impact our Scope 3 emissions. So I think there's a lot of other places where it will have an impact. And I go back to my earlier comment, we now then have a responsibility to put our heads up and say, well, in making our choices, how do we support those who are doing that work and punish or not buy from those who are just doing it like they've always done it?
Are any of you aware of any other states or jurisdictions looking at doing this kind of analysis as well?
Sophie's the best place to answer that.
No, we couldn't find anyone,
Right.
only for particular sectors.
Yeah.
So, construction in New South Wales or much more focused and kind of granular analyses.
There's a question from Gordon, which I'm going to put straight to you, Sophie, or is it a more technical one, which is very interesting. Does the report look only at the production of products or their full life cycle emissions? Some energy efficiency and zero emissions products brought into the ACT may have generated Scope 3 emissions in their production, but over their life will save more Scope 1 or 2 emissions. I imagine we're thinking about, for instance, electric vehicles or highly efficient white goods or something like that.
No, we didn't look at that.
Right.
And that certainly is a good point. At what point do you replace technologies? We didn't look at that kind of complex calculation. It was more about really the carbon associated with a financial transaction. And after you have that data, that's when you start to make the decisions about, what's the low-hanging fruit for reduction. Yeah,
right. Which obviously is one of those tricky questions that I know people grapple with in terms of green building. If you want to, if you've got a really shocking leaky home, it may be more efficient in the longer term to do a knockdown rebuild for a really efficient one, but the emissions in the short term.
Yeah, absolutely. And we really didn't go into kind of that level of complexity. It was more that broadly, if you knock down a house and then rebuild a house with very high embodied carbon because of the materials and the size, but it's solar passive, that is not necessarily a good outcome if we're only focusing on operational efficiency, not the embodied impact.
Complex.
Tim, if I was going to jump back to a question that Kirsten Duncan put in there.
I was just going to put that question to you. Yeah. Do you want to jump on it?
Yeah, so Kirsten noted that the parliamentary and governing agreement doesn't reference Scope 3 emissions at all, and sort of asked what the government's response to this will be. Kirsten, the reason for that is, of course, this was in the 2019 climate change strategy, so in some ways it was already committed to, and by the time the election came around, we'd already commissioned Sophie to do the report, so the work was underway, but we didn't have these results. So it sort of didn't sit well with the PAGA, but under the legislation for the Commissioner, the government is formally required to respond to this report. Rebecca is now the responsible minister for the Commissioner, and so she will lead that response process, but it will need to be a whole of government response because obviously these recommendations cut across quite a few portfolios. Rebecca, you might remind me here, but I think we've either got, is it 3 or 6 months to provide the formal response?
I think it's 3 months.
Yeah, I'll have to check the legislation.
Yeah, we'll have to, I should know this, shouldn't I?
There is a timeline, and it will be in the first half of next year where there'll be a fully considered response. I mean, we've already made a range of comments on it and it's been tabled in the Assembly, but we'll go away and do that detailed work now as part of that formal process.
The other thing that I would just note in relation to the PAGA, that while it doesn't have explicit commentary around Scope 3, I think in some of the commitments that are made, it is implicit. And again, I would sort of look at some of our commitments that we've made around the sustainable building area. We did talk about a showcase demonstration projects that could include things like a building that, looking at Scope 3 in terms of the building, in terms of us wanting to really develop a pathway to being, world class in terms of our building sustainability. We have to look at embodied emissions and Scope 3 through some of that work. So, I think the PAGA implicitly, will, like some of the commitments that are made, we will need to address Scope 3 emissions when we think about these things.
There's a good conversation, a good exchange going on in the chat here about jumping off Michelle Smith's question from a while ago about labelling, whether it obviously brings up the need for better labelling, the capacity to do labelling around this complex sort of issue. I'd be really interested in each of your observations on the complexity and the possibility of that kind of approach.
I'll jump in first, Tim, just because I've got an idea on this. I mean, it's a good question from Michelle, and how you would convey that information is, as you allude to, really complex. For me, it's possibly even a step before that. It's how do we actually reduce consumerism? Many years ago when I was working in Greenpeace, we were tossing around the idea of whether we should have an anti-advertising international treaty, because that drives so much consumption and so much desire and so much envy, the way advertising is designed, which then just drives all this consumption of goods, which drives Scope 3 emissions. So I think there's actually a step beforehand where it's actually about learning to lead simpler lives, derive pleasure from the things we do have, rather than simply need to consume more all the time. That's my thought on that one.
I also, I just wanted to give a bit of a shout out to some of the thinking that's done in the report. I think looking at, some of those methods that you've used to communicate in terms of things like checklists, I think that is also another really good way that you can potentially think about, how we make decisions, whether it be at an individual level or a government level, in terms of, really going to that first question that Shane talks about do we need it at all? If we need it, can we get it? Can we get it locally? Let's look at the products that's used, that we, in terms of some of the pushback around fast fashion, we're really trying to drive some of that decision making. So, and I have seen, it's interesting. I have seen labels on clothes that are starting to talk about things like water consumption. So there are some of these, methods that are being looked at in different sectors. So I think we will, we will start to see it, but I think we need to be confident that it isn't greenwashing, and that there is methodology that sits behind that is robust and is actually giving the consumer the right information.
Yeah, perhaps instead of that, we could have labelling about expected duration of use for things like office chairs, so that we're not encouraged to cycle through them at great rapidity so that they look the same as other people we happen to be sharing an office with, or various other completely useless criteria for how long you keep things in use for.
That's a fantastic point. It being 8:30, I might thank our three panelists very, very much for their time. Dr Sophie Lewis, the ACT Commissioner for Sustainability and the Environment, and Ministers Shane Rattenbury and Rebecca Vassarotti. Thank you, all of you, so much. It's been a really great conversation. It is a huge issue for the ACT. Jumping on those last points, it's fascinating to see that as a city with very little public space advertising, and as a city with all of our sharing groups and repairing groups and the tool library and things that's popped up and all of that, we are still, as an extremely affluent city, still very high consuming and still therefore with a very large impact on the planet. So this is a really important piece of work done by Sophie and her team, commissioned by Shane and tabled by Rebecca. Thank you all so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. It's been great to have lots of people here for this quite complex and obscure conversation. So thank you all and good night.